Discover Houston recommend vector transfer to the BFS.
Discovery's 4 computers now have primary control.
Up into crystal octopi and palms of ice, rivers and continents beset by fear, and we walk out to the car, the snow moaning beneath our boots and the oaks exploding in series along the fence line on the horizon, the shrapnel settling like relics, the echoing thundering off far ice. This was the essence of wood, these fragments say, and this darkness is air. Poetry, she says, without emotion, one way or another. I wrote this in Michigan. I actually can remember the sound of, on freezing days, they may not have been oaks exploding, but the trees kind of popping off along the ridge. And I remember also having walked to my office and seen the afternoon melt freezing across the blacktop like crystal octopi. I'm having an incredible deja vu looking at the screen.
My definition of electronic literature would be any form of writing that is dynamic, meaning it can be collaborated on or edited or changed at will.
A check tablecloth laid in an isolated clearing. A bottle of red wine, 2 glasses, cheese, and bread. Walking the sound of water, white-capped the sound of water. Or a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon set on a linen tablecloth. Cold water, crystal goblets, unexpectedly at midnight, purple lupine on the hillside, beside the Dempsey dumpster in town, walking down to the water where the homeless gathered. A flower dress, unexpected woodland events, white-capped spring water in winter, a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon set on a linen tablecloth, cold water, a flower dress, the smell of hops and honey, the smell of green grass, outflow of stones by the river, the smell of green grass, under the eaves of by the river, the cabin where we were working, the sound of water, white-capped mountains, purple lupine on the hillside, making love.
Electronic literature is forms of literature that make use of the computer or the network context to achieve effects that wouldn't be possible in print.
My birth takes place more than once in the plea of a bygone monster from a muddy hole by corpse light, under the needle and under the pen. Or it took place not at all. But if I hope to tell a good story, I must leapfrog out of the muddle of my several births to the day I parted for the last time with the author of my being and set out to write my own destiny.
So it might start with smell when that's possible in the future. At present it starts with image very dominantly and proceeds through text to sound in kind of a hierarchy, which I very much dislike. But I think the opportunities within that for interaction between those different senses and different means of generating stuff are just fantastic, particularly when we bring similar algorithms to bear on all of them. And we see their interactions both at the code, the sonic, the visual, and the meaning level.
Electronic literature is the exploration of concepts beyond the ordinary using electronic means. And in traditional vision-based media, you have moving pictures, you have more traditional genres such as, printed text where things don't move around, but electronic literature involves exploring how we take concepts, how we perceive the world and ourselves, and trying to portray that using computation, using the specific processes that are unique to computers.
There are 2 main literary parents for me, for the fiction, and one of them is Thomas Pynchon, and Gravity's Rainbow, which is a novel which contains within it music hall numbers, popular songs, equation. There are no visible artworks, but there is a tremendous reference to the language of art and film and music and theater, and that was a mental model for me that the novel did not have to proceed in a linear fashion using only narrative.
Electronic literature for me is literature that takes advantage of the capacity of new media to alter the state of writing.
It's literature that engages its digitality.
I remember sitting in my office in Jackson, Michigan, in community college, and thinking, damn, I'm going to have to teach people how to read this thing.
Prepared, sugar is not a volume. In the glass doors, these circumstances, very clean if there is no seen variety, very small there is no pleasure, overly moist prepared, sugar is not a volume. Not having examined the room, grabbing at these rags, kindness, related to the vulture, and however, in varying sides and the door, for the sake, journey to use, last, they are double, for the sake, and rapid exploration requires most common classes, while the bodies, by the crowd, justified by appeal.
Electronic literature is two words that go together, resonate together. I suppose I would say it can be considered practice involving text that resonates with considerations of media, resonates with problems of media or platforms of media, taking advantage of platforms of media, as Amrit said, or for me, resonating with conceptual issues involving mediation and digitization of information communication.
So the first screen you see is this big image made in Mac Paint, if anyone knows what that is. It's just like a splash page, an image of the patchwork girl herself. Click through it to what is essentially a title page, Patchwork Girl or a Modern Monster by Mary Shelley and herself. And from here you have links to 5 different sections of the text: the graveyard, the journal, the quilt, the story, and something called broken accents.
I think electronic literature is literature which requires a device to be read, and the device has to be electronic.
I worked with artist books. I was influenced by the works that I saw at Camera Works, by Works in San Jose, which is and by the art space at San Jose State that Stephen Moore curated. So I was in a field that was halfway between visual arts and halfway between writing. And of course performance art also that I was associated with, and the artist books. So those were interests that I continued with.
Electronic literature is machine-enabled stories, poems, images that are not available only as traditional print or sculptural events. They're mediated by machines, and they don't exist in a format that the other arts have traditionally taken.
Boxes, raising the dirt, only several colors. Tall the one cluster away, variety each a method, package of seeds, disparate. The several not
Stone
in rows.
Especially smooth, location chip it down. Magnify the bottom, darting and then habitual shadow, scene bending.
We're all moving toward storytelling in digital space, and some of the most interesting experiments that are happening are in electronic literature.
You're coming out of a Dadaist tradition of saying there's something beyond this, and I'm going to rearrange this stuff and find other layers beyond the visible, or make other layers.
I think electronic literature is digital-born literature that would not exist otherwise than by mediation through a computer.
Electronic literature is the exploration of how we can tell stories with the augmentation of technology. So what technology makes possible in our storytelling palette. I'm particularly thinking about kind of the networked and connective tissues of literature and storytelling, and the ways that we realize those through the technologies we already use all the time, particularly on the web.
The lack of clear signals isn't an attempt to vex you, rather an invitation to read either inquisitively or playfully and also at depth. Click on words that interest you or invite you.
Electronic literature can be a number of things. It's interactive. It has to do with words and images.
I go in and out of what to call myself. I still say different things. Within the community, I create electronic literature, which I would call poetic narrative. So I'm a poet who worked with narrative.
I think the day that comes that we don't actually to distinguish it as electronic literature is the day that we finally, would be the day that, we don't have to ask questions like that.
An otherworldly glass of beer. Up here, but wouldn't you like an otherworldly glass of beer? But wouldn't you like an otherworldly glass of blackberry bushes? Just beside the trail as you crest the hill, amber-colored beer in a tall crystal glass, white foam running down the sides, the smell of hops and honey, a golden icebox. But wouldn't you like an otherworldly glass of beer? The sound of the water, white-capped mountains, amber-colored the sound in a tall crystal white-capped mountains, cold water, amber-colored beer in a tall running down the sides, cold water down to the water, the smell of hops and honey, the daily in and out flow of a billion bites, the smell in and out flow of a billion bites, the smell of green grass, a red front door,
It is
stones by the river,
word,
a red front door,
image, sound, moving image,
amber-colored
touch,
beer in a tall crystal
bits,
glass, white
mind, body, heart.
To be linked to the chain of existence and events, yes, but bound by it, no. I forge my own links. I'm building my own monstrous chain. And as time goes on, perhaps it will begin to resemble, rather, a web.
Primarily artistic work that has a strong emphasis in the literary, but cannot be divorced from its medium, which is digital, and so you can't print it. It's not like an ebook.
One of the challenges I had set for me for this text was to try to write a novel that no 20th century writer could write. And the only way to do that is obviously to try to push the text itself beyond what it's possible to do. So including projective things like the oracle, including a burrower that literally takes the text and reconfigures it in ways that cannot be predicted. And that, I think, is what Burroughs is getting at. It's that the text itself can be exploded, and that when you take those pieces and reassemble them, something new can come out that you did not even put there, that you did not know was there. And that is what makes it, it pushes it beyond what you as a writer can possibly do.
I guess I would say that electronic literature is reading, and it could be symbols, it could be icons, through some sort of electronic means. It could be digital, it could be analog electricity, and so something I would say interactive would be maybe a key word, but not necessarily. Kinetic, perhaps, or a couple of things, but I feel like it's such a broad thing, it's hard to just define. I think you just gotta be open to what's out there.
Hypertext, to put it clearly, is a mapping of a text onto a four-dimensional space. Normal grammars then do not apply and become branching structures anew. Fragments, branches, links.
The word is glowing and on a screen. It is electronic and cannot be touched. It has been copied over thousands of times and reverberates through virtual space. The text coils in on itself. It is a topographic map of the air currents in the upper atmosphere, those sudden winds that change direction, inexplicable.
The reader becomes a sort of satellite taking photographs of a huge and varied terrain. The reader can see the whole world or zoom in to see a particular ant on the banks of the Seine. The ant has 6 legs. The reader is staring at a video screen. How then to turn the page?
To me, electronic literature is any kind of literary practice that does not depend on the printed page, but may include print.
Remember, I have to remember, you have to remember where we are, that I wrote this entire text in the machine, and so I was always its first reader, and I was discovering the ways that it changed in there. There was never a flow chart, there was never any set of text to say the way through. So I was pursuing kinds of texture too.
There are a lot of electronic literature classes, but how many are actually teaching students the range of what they can do in the field? How many new student writers are we producing? We are producing some, but not enough.
It was one of my central theses in Patchwork Girl that there is no central thesis, that there is no center, that there is no self, there is only a temporary and contingent coming together of influences and borrowed pieces that could as easily have come together in another form and will come together in another form, that the desire to make oneself coherent and permanent is a doomed one, but not only doomed, also an unhealthy one, that part of our job is to learn to let go of ourselves. And literature is one of the ways we learn to let go of ourselves, learn to release ourselves into the stream of other people's thoughts and visions, and to enjoy that alienation from our own monotonous dream of consciousness.
And I think literature is the use of language to sort of disrupt its instrumental applications, right? So the question of electronic literature then is how are people working in the digital vernacular or the emerging sort of media landscape to estrange people from the conventional codes that try to organize human behavior and to create an occasion for something otherwise.
We look now at how simple it is to create immersive, full-res images, and we just did not have that technology. So I am very happy with the narrative premise, and I'm very happy with the way I executed given the constraints, but I would really wish I could fix some of those pictures.
Electronic literature is anything that you can't do in a linear print, and electronic is the wrong word here. It's anything that stretches text beyond what we have been doing. So I'm actually not too happy about the electronic, digital, analog idea. What I want to say is that we are stretching text, and I'd like to go back to the traditional meaning of hypertext, which was overactive text.
Complex, more material, the spiral, a thread. Drinking, genetic memory contents, womb, dancing ground. The massive against control. Complex, more material, the spiral, a thread. A life after, meet, split, unite.
For me, electronic literature is anything that's generated in new media that involves reading and writing. And that reading and writing can be connected to any other medium because of the electronic context.
Closure is, as in any fiction, a suspect quality, although here it's made manifest. I wasn't aware exactly how inflammatory that was. I've been burned by that over the years, and people say, oh, well, I remember somebody writing in the New York Times saying that this was an immoral work because it didn't have a beginning, middle, and end, and that literary work should have a beginning, middle, and end, and that closure was what made something moral. When the story no longer progresses, or when it cycles, or when you tire of the paths, the experience of reading it ends. Even so, there are likely to be more opportunities than you think there are at first. A word which doesn't yield the first time you read a section may take you elsewhere if you choose it when you encounter the section again. And sometimes what seems a loop, like memory, heads off in another direction. There is no simple way to say this. Probably the most well-known sentence in the entire work, except maybe the first sentence, is there is no simple way to say this.
My response to what is electronic literature is, if you can read it, see it, hear it, play it, and sing it, it's probably electronic literature.
Midnight and at who divulged only and at who divulged only the system under the login of a long-departed guest, whose password still resided in my memory. Midnight, the incoming from Mary was not divulged only at that hour. She too entered the system under the login. Who are you, guest two? Scrolled across my screen deleted by a chat request.
Electronic literature is literature that's made on the computer and intended to be read on the computer.
Digital work that addresses questions of reading and writing.
And I believe that electronic literature is literature that uses the internet or computers or mobile phones or such technology to function.
My definition of electronic literature would be multimodal digital production meant to be read on a screen, computer screen.
As far as electronic literature goes, whoa, that's a toughie. I think it's literature that can't be presented in a static way, such as on a printed page. So there's something about the digital that is intrinsic to the work of art.
My definition of electronic literature is digital narrative is the first term that comes to mind because that's how I entered into the group. But the longer I have been here, I have found it means poetics, it means coding, it means all sorts of ways of manipulating language using digital technology, and not always to tell a story.
Well, for me, electronic literature is a strange hybrid that combines a literary sensitivity with all the potential that digital technology can provide the artist.
Literature, whether consumed or created on some type of electronic medium, which would mean something like a computer or anything that needs electricity or requires electricity.
It's organic, like the branches of a tree.
Yeah, it's an electric toaster in that tree that serves up pop-up poetry.
I would define electronic literature as any text that can only exist on a computer.
Electronic literature feels to me like something that has been deliberately left undefined and perhaps undefinable. I think that it's a concept in transition that may actually never find a definition and fade from our vocabulary before anything gets codified or settles in.
I think electronic literature is anything that is branching and interactive.
Works that make use of the capabilities of the digital context and the digital properties to create pieces of work. I don't know, some kind of that kind of stuff.
I consider electronic literature to be literary work with interesting literary aspects. It takes advantage of the capabilities of the computer, whether it's networking, multimedia, computation, interactivity, and it is extending what the literary means using computation and computers and their capabilities.
When I think about what is electronic literature, it gets kind of tied up with other terms that we have used to define this field. We've called it hypertext, digital literature, new media literature, electronic literature. All those four terms have been used to define the field or name the field that we are in. Hypertext was one of the earliest names, and it extends beyond the electronic screen. If you go back to Ted Nelson's definition of that, it's a conceptual way of how do you provide more text than what was traditionally available or possible in a printed book. Then when we got to computer, it was a natural medium for creating those hypertext type of experiments. That then morphed into digital literature and into digital literature, new media literature. I hate the term new media literature because it arrogantly assumes that what we're working in will always be the newest thing. Just like new criticism, after a time that term becomes dated. But digital literature and now electronic literature, The electronic literature is probably the broadest term for what we're working with, but we're still usually talking about something that's created for the computer. And but I think it should be still tied to some of those early discussions that we were having with hypertext. Some early themes such as multilinearity, questions of authority, questions of agency, questions of interactivity, questions of play, that those would still be part of the questions of what we're talking about when we're talking about electronic literature. So it isn't just, does it use electricity? It has to be, to some degree, in what way does it tie in with what can we do in this medium to make the literature more interactive, more playful?
What I think for me of electronic literature is finding ways that people communicate in real life about their real lives, and then fictionalizing them, however they're doing that. And that kind of changes with every new technology. But there's sort of a moment where people are enacting themselves through some new form of writing, and then I love getting in there and creating fake, imaginary characters and having impossible things happen in that format.
For me, digital literature is a relationship between the literary dimension and the medium specificity dimension, the digital dimension, and the way we can think, in a specific way, this relationship between literary and digital medium.
It's really difficult to define electronic literature, but for me what it means is literature created and meant to be read on the computer. I think we need some qualifier to distinguish it. I'm not sure electronic is the correct term. Myself, I'm more inclined to digital literature. I do think the field is growing, it's continuing to develop, more people know about it, and there's very interesting kind of hybrid forms that combine games and electronic literature. And I think there's possibilities for a lot of development. At the same time, I would also argue that literature is becoming a coterie interest. It's moving out of the cultural mainstream position it occupied in the 19th century and more to the periphery as other media forms come to dominate.
The main graphic will display all the images it can find. Confine the overlay animation to the left side of the window. / done. The poem splashes itself in glorious spectra across the sky dome of heaven.
We are composing a culture with one work upon another.
The Pathfinders Project is a preservation project that aims to make electronic literature available for generations beyond us. This project is very important because if you think about it, early digital literature represents a cultural moment and a historical change in the way we think about literature.
In Pathfinders, we used a concept called Traversal, a way of capturing author and user interactions on the work's original platform.
I wanted the reader to feel that there were distinctly different human stories.
This is fundamentally embodied.
Somebody told me it was their bedtime story every day, and it was a lot of fun to do, and I also found telling the story that way appealed to the social media nature of the audience.
We think this method of preservation, in conjunction with things like migration and emulation, will keep crucial works alive so that future readers can better understand them. Without a doubt, we have the potential to transform the field of digital media preservation. This multimedia book is just the beginning.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for the 5th of 7 live stream Traversal broadcasts from the Electronic Literature Lab at Washington State University, Vancouver. Today we're performing Rob Kendall's hypertext poem, A Life Set for Two. I'm Deanie Grigar, the director of the lab and professor in the Creative Media and Digital Culture program here at the university. This event is part of the Born Digital Media Preservation series that celebrates the Electronic Literature Organization's move from MIT to WSUV. It's sponsored by this university as well as WSU's Lewis E. and Stella G. Buchanan Distinguished Professorship and, of course, the Electronic Literature Organization. If this is the first time you've joined us for one of these traversals, you're probably wondering what the heck we mean by a traversal. This is a process that was developed for the Pathfinders project by Stuart Moulthrop and me, and it's defined as an audio and video recording of a demonstration performed on a historically appropriate platform by an author and or reader of the work. Think of it as a more formal game playthrough. That's essentially what we're doing. For this traversal, our reader is Dr. John Barber, and he will be using an original CD-ROM on which A Life Set for Two was originally published in 1996, and he'll be looking at this work on a compact PC running a Windows 98 software. We're live streaming this traversal as well as capturing the social media content that's generated during this event. We're collecting this information along with critical references, images of the different media that we're looking at, and other content for the open source book created on the Scalar platform called Rebooting Electronic Literature. The book is available for viewing now. We've opened it up so that every chapter, as we're working on it, you can see us producing the chapter, so it's not a finished book that is refined and ready to be read. You're looking at the work in production. We have finished the first good draft of Sarah Smith's King of Space, and we're very close to finishing David Kolb's Socrates in the Labyrinth, and Jane Yellow Lee's Douglas's I Have Said Nothing. The URL is showing up in your browser. I believe someone's going to be posting that on Facebook and Twitter for you today. I'd like to acknowledge Rob Kendall, the artist. He's going to be joining us today online in the chat, and he's given a lot of time for an interview, so I have some information that I can share that he's given us that's not really published anywhere else that I've seen. We also want to thank John Barber, who teaches in the program and is performing today. I want to also acknowledge my colleagues in the Electronic Literature Lab. First, I'll start with Nicholas Schiller, who is my Associate Director of the lab, Greg Philbrook, the Instructional and Technology Support Specialist, Vanessa Rhodes, she's the ELIT Research Assistant, Veronica Whitney, the L Catalog Content Specialist, Mariah Gwynn, the Games Research Assistant, and Katie Bowen, the Document Specialist. The link to this live stream will be archived in the L website, which we'll be posting information on about, and then also we'll be posting this on Facebook and Twitter. Our Facebook channel and Twitter hashtag are both eLit Pathfinders. John will perform the work for approximately about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll follow this up with a Q&A, and the Q&A will also include Rob Kendall online. You can post your questions via Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube chat, and we'll answer them for you. So thank you for being here today. Let's get started.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Deanie, for that very kind and generous introduction. Performing, I don't know, I'll do my best with that. Let me just get situated in the cockpit here. I am using, as Deanie suggested, a compact PC computer. I've already loaded the disk from the original Eastgate. Well, you're seeing the back of it. This is very hard. I've loaded the disk onto the computer. It's set. I simply need to click on the exe file to launch, and this then is the opening screen for A Life Set for Two by Robert Kendall. The first thing that I notice about this is that the text here at the top of the title portion of the page is constantly changing and showcasing an interesting combination of two lines of words that seem to each speak to a notion of what might be the literary experience that we're in for. So just reading a few of them as they appear: an intra-telling, a hyper-telling, a winding telling, a winding reflection, a soft reflection, an electronic reflection, an intra-reflection, a virtual reflection, a hyper-reflection, a hypertext, a hyperverbarium, an organic verbarium, an organic recalling, an organic poem, a hyperpoem, and it goes on from here. Available information on this particular screen beyond the title page, which is being showcased presently. Publication information, as Deanie mentioned to you, published in 1996 by Robert Kendall by Eastgate Systems, at that time located in, perhaps still located in Watertown, Massachusetts. I might just make an interesting trivial connection here that at this very same time in nearby Cambridge, Massachusetts, Van Morrison was working out the content of his very famous but still relatively unknown record album, Astral Weeks. Acknowledgements. The very first thing that Robert Kendall notes is the program was written in Microsoft Visual Basic by the author. I think this is interesting. It launches us into a work of electronic literature and interaction with a computer program that is not HTML or CSS based, and not, in my mind, an example of traditional hypertext where we click on words. It's also important, I think, to note that all the graphics that I hope you'll see were created by the author. This will be talked about a little later, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but an excerpt from this poem has appeared elsewhere, and Deanie will talk about that along with Robert Kendall when they are talking later. How to read this poem is quite a lengthy bit of information, as you can see. I'm scrolling through it here. It's a lot to read, it's a lot to digest, and frankly it's a lot to remember as you actually engage with the poem. So I'll just attempt to summarize it by saying that there's opportunities to choose from menus that allow us to get to different parts of the poem, and we can also change the emotional tenor of the program itself, and then eventually we have the opportunity to ask for the check and finish that particular reading and exit the poem. Selecting the poem itself, the last choice in the contents column here, then takes us to what would appear to be a tablecloth, some sort of setting and the prologue begins. I try to remember the days when things were clearer, when the air didn't sag underneath the single-minded yellow haze of how it all turned out. Back then it seemed I could see for miles through a promise or two, especially at night when I lay beside her with the world turned off, gazing up at our overarching stars. Note the changing of the text here. This is an interesting feature of Visual Basics and allows, I think, Kendall to play with multiple meanings of multiple words that might be inserted into the text at this point. In the upper right hand corner is a pop-up menu with 3 buttons. The one to the left is reread, the one in the middle allows us to choose options, and the one to the right is to move onward with whatever we're reading. Let's choose that one at this point, and now we have a new serving of text. Now I look around at the unimaginably real backdrops for the wrong show and wonder how I ended up here. The way back is gone, but has left its many ghostly directions endlessly shifting in a pale dance. Come with me in search of my hard-to-please, willful past, well-meaning past that refuses to mark time but won't let me take its arm in the fading tango. Let's try a hand at the memory arcade. Note that we're seeing here on this second screen text that we have seen and probably will see again. This is one of the features of the work, is that the content in many ways are reprised throughout the work. Checking the options simply because it's available, but also to let us know a little bit more about what we can do. The text is currently displayed in what Kendall's calling kinetic text, i.e. moving text, text that's appearing and in some cases disappearing from the screen. We can select static text, and then according to the lengthy instructions we would see all of the text as one piece rather than it appearing one line at a time. If we decide to continue with kinetic text, we can control the speed. We can also control the length of time, that is the pause between the lines. We can also configure our reading experience by applying what Kendall calls aftertaste, which could be emotional shading, as he calls it, to the reading. We can do this always or never, or we can leave it up to the poem. The poem's discretion seems like a good choice to me, so I will leave it that way. Yesterday's specials, we haven't seen this yet, but we will momentarily. Again, I'll leave this up to the poem's discretion. We can also, if we choose, skip the prologue, and we can also control the pause time. So I'll just leave all of this as it is by selecting OK. We're back to the prologue, and I'll continue forward by clicking the onward button. Now we have a choice, several boxes, heading past, past. Who's got the past? Is it under the hat, under the name of eternity, under an obligation to pass away, underhanded when underfoot, or is it understood that it can go its own way? The instructions here in the center of the screen are to click on a box, to lift it, and look underneath. So, under my hat, clicking on that. Oh, look, a secret message. Nothing under here but what's ahead. Under the name of eternity, perhaps the answer's there. No, it goes by the names my mortality calls out in its sleep. Underhanded, when it's underfoot, might we find what we're looking for there? No, if I stumble and fall when I am not looking where I've been, I can't blame myself. Under an obligation to pass away, old pasts never die, they just climb into all we've lost and live there forever. Whoa, how true is that? Finally, understood that it can go away. Yes, let's follow it and see where it leads. This, by the way, is automatic. I didn't click on anything, but we're back to the display of text on what might appear to be a tablecloth at a cafe. Ah, of course, the past knows a romantic little place where the finished dreams glisten forever like overpriced wine in the candlelight. Clicking on Onward, we receive the welcome screen. Welcome to Cafe Passé. Fine food, fine thought. There once was a life set for two here somewhere. Its days were hard and brittle, ice cubes in the soup I shared with her then at the only table left in our happiness. The band was rehearsing our souls, nervous and low, inner notes that trembled at the edge of tempo, then fell over into hunger. Even now, after all this time, the menu comes back to me with its choices still hurting. The taste of badly missed chances still teeters somewhere in my mouth. Now we have the two menus. Cafe Passé menus, what fed her on the right and what fed me on the left. Several choices, menu choices under each one, and the aftertaste submenu in the upper right hand corner allows us to flavor these menus in any way that we might like. Notice that when I click on any of these, some choices appear and some disappear in the two menus. So let's just start with the what fed her menu, and I'll select first the sublisting here called Fruits Fall. The background changes, it's now blue. We can see on the left a fork, on the right a knife and spoon, and silhouette what looks like a black placemat behind the box in which the text appears, and it's all covered blue. Ah, the fruit gone by. It's always nicely chilled by the lengthening shadows. I try to remember the things left to ripen, how I thought I could hear in them the gentle pattering of something dropping to the forest floor. What hope fell from the trees that grew nowhere, the light falling early, like someone falling for that old trick, happiness, like desire falling into place? She smiled and held my emptiness tenderly, like a basket. Now this choice brings me now to what fed me, and menu choices here. Let's see what fed me under the subheading of false fruit brings up. I told her I loved walking through her promises in their autumn, their colors so crisp and delicate, her need rustling gently through her meanings. A candy wrapper, a rusty can't added an artful touch of veracity to the scene as they lay there among her fallen fruit. I picked up an apple we could share. Back to the what fed her menu. I'll just go top to bottom in these choices, but realize that any order one would want to work through the poem is available here. This is entitled The Juicy Part. When the weather, spelled W-H-E-T-H-E-R, got harsher, our hopes went indoors. Just right, she said, sitting down at the small, warm feeling I'd set my heart on like a dish on a wobbly table in a quiet corner. She held it steady to explore the delicately spiced place, that moist flavor pulsing inside like a quivering of breath against cold glass. Clicking onward, the next lexia, her tongue worked slowly, almost as if tracing initials on a steamed-up window. Through all the layers of hunger's metaphors, I meant what I tasted like, and she knew it. Back to the menu of what fed me. Next choice here, staying with the same pathway as used with the opposing menu, I'm selecting seasoned fruit. Now absence prepares the tropes like a chef adding more and more water to the sauce. But I'll never forget how she was the only one I could tell myself to, like the story, the riddle, her ending, her answer had been waiting for. I lured my heart on board the tale and sent it off, a frightened traveler clutching its ticket for women's territory, that walled city with breasts. Her scenery was staggering. Her wayside, wayward stands were irresistible with their proud local delicacies, though when I took a bite, it was my own pride I swallowed. Her dusty highways were all wrong, but they taught me a tenderness that wasn't on the maps. Now back to the Café Passé menu, what fed her? The next choice in line is titled Dainties Under Glass. When I happened onto the night back road after dark, I could see the lighted window of her affection, the shade carefully left open a crack. She knew I would work up the nerve to listen in, to peep in, and catch my plot thickening between her caressing lips, better times on the verge of coming. Then the lights went off, and the intimate blindness filled in the rest. Now both menus are available, and notice that only one choice is left in this new menu, yesterday's specials, and a few choices still left on the What Fed Me menu from Café Passé. I'll choose the meat of our bodies from yesterday's special. Isn't that true? And have a choice of lips, thighs, breasts, or hands. I'll choose hands. Now the background image changes, sort of a ghosted, outlined, luminescent, phosphorescent images of a fork on the left and a knife on the right, black background against which the text is appearing one line at a time. Flesh is a closet, it reads, with a skeleton in it. We both knew it when I squeezed her delicately boned wrists and dragged her around back of the pane. I climbed her like a creaking stairway to the room we didn't talk about. With the taste of her at my lips and my hand on the knob, I looked down. She was below, with a bruised vacancy, no vacancy, posted in her eyes. The menu What Fed Me appears now. I'll choose Manna from the Stars. See what that serving is like. Afterward, we ended up together in front of yet another late-night rerun of ourselves as it began to get light outside and the pizza got colder and soggier. We unfolded painfully behind reach on the screen, and there was nothing I could do about it. She knew the ending. I knew the ending, yet the ending never seemed to know us. She needed it one more time. Can't we just turn it off? I asked. Now yesterday's specials appears on the left-hand side of the screen. Love's Desserts is the one which is active, signified in red. The meat of our bodies is supposedly not available because of its being grayed out. Let's choose Love's Desserts. And look, on Love's dessert tray, help yourself, all there is love. So let's choose that. And then there was love, with all its own appetites. It lived off whatever it could catch inside me. It lived off the things that held us together, chewing and chewing on the delicate bonds, tasting, testing each fiber. It fed on her trusting pain, her furrowed need. She wore the bites like excruciating jewelry. Now the what fed her menu appears again, and all of the choices are once again available for us. Let's choose naughty treats. See what that's all about. I tried not to meet her pained eyes. Her look fumbled at me like a key at a locked shed. What did she hope to find inside? A misplaced bottle with a label she alone could make out? Miracle cure for the future that ails you. Or maybe a heart-shaped box in red foil. My way of saying, I'm sorry, as if my whole life were an insensitive remark and I hadn't really meant it like that at all. I kept my eyes to myself while I shifted the empty jars from shelf to shelf. Now we have both menus available, and for the first time we can add some seasoning. Choices here are touch of another man or family to taste. I think you're beginning to get the idea that this is a poem about a relationship on the rocks, neither person in the relationship willing to come right out and be honest about it. So let's just be brazen and select touch of another man. And let's see, we've not yet followed this menu choice, wild game in season. Perhaps that will be another man, who knows? An Italian man with a ponytail. There was nothing like a good game of unhappiness. I dealt her thoughtless blows from the bottom of the deck, and she held them face down like cruel aces, getting ready for the payoff and the little girl tears she would try to buy me off with. I'm not your father, I said. All right. Wow, that was quite a dish. Look over here on the what fed me portion. The recipe is available. Let's try that. When I stood pat, she gave me the look that cleaned my slate, leaned over and began to write with the most vulnerable parts of her anger, spilling herself in her lap. Somehow only a sharp-eyed cruelty in me could read those desperately scrawled ingredients for her misery. The bitterest were written in a man's hand. This is probably a good time to take advantage of the fact that the check, please, has first appeared here at the bottom of yesterday's special menu. We are just about out of time, so let's call for the check. And then we're asked, are we ready to settle the account and leave? The highlighted choice is yes. One would assume that by clicking no, you could go back and continue to read and continue to explore other aspects of the poem. But I have selected yes. The heading now is yesterday's specials, the check, please. And look, the check is written in poetry. Yet it was she who saw what I was really made of. She left, taking a load, a piece, off my future. I went home alone and somehow didn't quite fit back into my life, but rather hung over it like news that hadn't yet broken. Selecting onward. What price am I going to have to pay? I began to wonder if the loneliness ahead would ever piece the story together. I began to fear that she was the understanding I'd pulled out from under myself. I began to fear that I was just a brilliantly cruel plot against both of us that had unfolded too perfectly, neutralizing adversaries by pointing the gun deep inside myself. Apparently, a heavy price I will pay. On sleepless nights, they materialize before me in black and white, in the terse lines that will soon become the world at dawn, the obscure forms waiting for me to fill them out with the rest of my life. I want to tell myself they almost make sense now. I want to tell myself, Press hard. You're making copies for 1,000 missed opportunities. But I can't escape the feeling that this is nothing more than the paperwork for all I've destroyed. Now, a choice, either the end, which is highlighted, or the beginning. Again, because of time constraints here, I will select the end. Clicking on that brings us then back to the title page, and the shifting nature of this poem continues to flash a virtual text, a virtual reflection, an organic reflection, an organic poem, a kinetic poem. Either of those seem to be appropriate for what we've just done. So, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Someone will feed them to me, and then if there's questions from the audience, then we'll just ask, and you can add. Those of you who are online can put the answers in the posts so that people online can hear the responses, okay? So do you guys have any questions to start? I saw your comments. They were wonderful comments. Holly?
Yeah, I was wondering how long it took him to make the piece.
I didn't ask him that question, but I'm assuming it was about a year because he was publishing some of this in excerpts around 1995-ish. So as John mentioned earlier, it was published beforehand, little pieces of it. So if you hand me the little volume here. Some of the work was published in this great little CD issue of the little magazine in 1995. So this is very cool. And I didn't realize we had this. I was going to buy it online on eBay, but we just got another donation, and I haven't had a chance to process everything yet. And this was sitting there, and I thought, oh my gosh, here it is. So. And then another piece was published in a magazine called Lips. So there are a lot of these small indie magazines and journals, the literary journals that were, emerging at the period. Sometimes online journals came in the 1995 onward, and pieces were being, published there. And then in one place did this show up in Eastgate. Can you hear me, the Eastgate thing? One of the things I was going to mention to all of you. Because some of you have never seen this stuff before, but this is what Eastgate Systems Inc. published for the Hypertext, and they published 45 of these over the course of the last, starting 1990 until, recently, and they're still publishing some things. And so if you look at it, it looks like a little book, right? So this would sit on the shelf, and I have 300 of them up in my shelf there, and they have a nice spine so you can see them on the shelf, so that libraries can actually buy them and put them on the shelf. You open them up, and they would have here in the slot one of the CDs or floppy disks in some cases, and then a little booklet. And the booklets are kind of fun because they tell you how to put the CD into the computer, load the file, how to essentially use the computer to read the work, which is something print books don't have to do. In some cases, these little books also came with critical essays, and a lot of times they come with advertisements. So this one advertises 2 coming works, right?
Here's the essays.
Yeah, here are the essays here. This one is Robert Kendall's Words and Mirrors, right? So here's his essay here. So they function in multiple ways, these little manuals, but this looks like a book. On the back is like a book jacket with, testimonials, great work, excellent writing, that kind of thing. This was published with Richard Smyth's Genesis, a Rhizography, and in Eastgate Systems' special collection called the Eastgate Quarterly Review of Hypertext. And several of these were put out through the years. So, but there was like a breadcrumb from print-based books to the digital world. So they're really interesting to look at. It's almost like looking at album covers. There's a nostalgia for that. You made a comment about color.
Yeah, I wasn't sure when it happened. I thought it started out, the tablecloth was really brightly colored, and there was that really intense blue that was used for the menus, and at some point, and it happened really subtly, which is probably an indication of how well it was done, it transitioned to very dark and much like the relationship, so I like that a lot.
Mm-hmm. And some of you are noticing the movement of the words, right? Was that you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I noticed that, like, just the changing text, because I'd seen some previous work with, like, in JavaScript that would do that, and so it was cool to see it in another piece, and that was probably my favorite part of it, is just it allows the poem to kind of change context, and it's just something that's just not possible in print.
Yeah,
No.
like the poem was kind of like raining across the screen or coming from the sides at times. It really reflected the mood, especially when it turned black. And
Yeah, he uses color symbolism quite well for that. But going back to movement, that's called kinetic poetry. We use the term kinetic poetry for this genre, right? Because it's moving. And I laughingly tell students in my electronic literature class that if this happened on a print book, you'd probably have to have your medication adjusted. It's an affordance of the digital medium, but it's not something that came out of nowhere. I believe, Katie, you were posting, or maybe Vanessa, posting Kuno's 1,000 Million Poems and the image.
I didn't post the image though.
Yeah, do you want to mention what that is?
So this is what
It's easier to show,
before. So it had strips that, it's you're talking about the sonnets?
Yeah.
Yeah, so 10 sonnets, and then with each line, which is about 15, it seems like, which is probably where the 10,000, 100,000 comes from. But each strip is a different line that can be interchangeable within the sonnet.
So to do that physically in a book, print book, can you imagine trying to publish that? You don't see many of this around. I mean, I have some, if you ever want to come up and see some cool artist books that do this, I have some examples in my collection. But it's not easy to do, but you can do this with JavaScript, right?
Yeah. It's interesting. Like, I'm sure that there's more like this out there, but I want more pieces like this, like in terms of like being able to be interactive, but also it tells a story that the author's still in control, but it does feel like, I mentioned, like it feels like the reader has more agency to it, like they're also adding something to the story. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I think Will does this well in 355, where he tries to teach you how to conceptualize the medium so that whatever decisions you make in that space when you're coding or picking words or whatever it is you're doing for your websites, you're thinking about the big concept. So if the words are blinking, changing, for Rob Kendall, it was because that's how memories function. We don't have things static in our brains all the time. We can't remember exactly what he was wearing that day. We can't remember exactly the music that was playing that day. Maybe we can. And so it's that maybe that splashing in our brains, and he's capturing that experience with the medium, which is friggin' cool, right? And that's what good conceptual thinking does, right? And so that's why I think I call this a tour de force, in that it's a great programming piece, but it's also a good conceptualization piece. I want to talk to John about his reading. That was a great reading, John Barber.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Did you want to talk a little bit about your experience reading it?
Well, it reminded me and felt very much like liminal dreaming, where like early in the morning you're just awake enough to know that you're awake, but you're still also partially asleep. And for me anyway, I have to just be personal about this, it's mostly thoughts of regret, missed opportunities, things that have gone wrong, people that I've done wrong in some way or another. And I would think, oh, I wish I'd had another opportunity, or I should have done more with that particular opportunity. I mean, it seems that this is a poem about two people in a relationship, and the relationship is, as I've said, is gone sour, gone bad, gone south, whatever. And neither one of them wants to acknowledge the fact that it has. that both of them is trying to be mean to the other, mean enough to the other, so that the other will make the decision to end the relationship, thus absolving the other person of any, further feelings of guilt. Now that's pretty deep and pretty hefty psychological stuff to deal with, and I think Robert Kendall does it really well in his use of language and the way that language is utilized in text, and text itself is used as image to display those ideas on the screen. So it's at one time it's dark in terms of reading, but there's also, I think, moments of humor and brightness and illumination that are there that could cause us to think and realize that there's something of reality regarding the world in this poem, which is a wonderful outcome.
Yeah, he's interviewed in several places in which he talks about how he wanted to make this poem very human. And I think it is a human tendency to forget, to remember, and also to be cowardly in relationships. Many times we're very cowardly. Yeah.
I think it also reflects not just the partner relationship, but also like the human relationship as well. Like with people we come into contact with, like after high school, you sometimes lose a friend, and that kind of reflects the story as well. Like with all the things that people are so acquainted with and technology these days that we sometimes forget, like where to establish that connection. Like in the story, I talked about how the two people were like going their separate ways, but like with people, they sort of don't really know where they're going in life.
Yeah, there's three kinds of love. Agape is brotherly love, right? And then eros is erotic love, and then there's philos, the love of things. And so if you think of agape and eros, they're both about human relationships, how we deal with each other. And this could be, we could think of it in terms of friendships as well as love affairs, right? How we're cowardly in these things. So how about we're used to reading hypertext in terms of clicking on links and moving around. Do you want to talk about how this is different?
Yeah, I mean the term hypertext is actually used by Kendall in the forward materials and also in his artist statement that's in the in the book that you've already mentioned. But I think it's clear that this is not what we might consider typical hypertext, where we click on a word and then the magic of hypertext takes us somewhere along the forking path, the branching path, whatever we might want to call it, to another node. Here, the pathway is linear, and it's forward only unless you want to bail out of the program completely, and then you have to exit. So I don't know that I would be totally comfortable in saying that this is hypertext in capital letters, but rather a variety of it. But it's certainly well determined by the way the poem's constructed. The reader, the participant, the interactor has some opportunity to color the emotions behind the readings by making some menu choices, but it's not clear how much effect you have. The controls in the option panel are very interesting, but we can see a scale, a sliding indicator of more or less, but exactly what that means in terms of results is not necessarily clear. So as a reader, I felt like I was in the cafe, a fly on the wall, or at the next table, and maybe I was capable of overhearing these people and trying to figure out, well, what's going on here? What narrative can I create from overhearing their narrative, and especially hearing the tone or the lack of tone that might be associated in that narrative. And it gets to quickly be this secret kind of sick sense of wanting to go forward, wanting to know more, wanting to hear what's going to be said next. What are these people going to reveal of themselves and their relationship next? And I want to keep clicking onward to learn more, because it eventually I can make direct personal connections with things that are being said in this prose poem being presented on the screen.
This is 1996, so this is 22 years old.
Wow.
So think about it. And the browser was introduced in 1995. So this work came out, he was working on it as the browser was being disseminated and starting to be used. We were using it in 95, right? And so it's interesting to think about that time period, because we were living in that time period, working in this field in that time period, and these terms that we were using were so provisional. We didn't have the right terms for things. He also referred to his poetry as soft poetry, and he also referred to this as animated multimedia poetry. We had all these words we were making up because there was no novel poem. There was no set terminology. And so 22 years later, we look at this and go, yeah, that's not really hypertext. But at the time, that was really the term we used for a lot of stuff, just because there was not a lot of anything else. And so I think John is right when he says it's not really what we think of hypertext today, because things shook out differently. Today you're playing with things that in 22 years you're going to be sitting in a room like this, looking at it going, we don't call it that anymore. So you're living inside the same history experience that we had, but you're just not recognizing it yet, because when you're in it, you're not paying attention to it, right? So, but it's really interesting to go and look at his interviews and what he calls it here and there and this and that, and then eventually over the course of time we start to get a real sense of what to call this stuff.
I think there's also value though in seeing, because over time, terms, we conventionalize the way we talk about things, and they kind of calcify. I think there's some value in something like this to re-examine some of these. We tend to think of hypertext in a certain way right now, which might not necessarily be able to encompass all of what hypertext really is. And I think the term animated text is genius. That's almost more descriptive of what's going on than a term like hypertext.
When I was in Dubai, we were in Dubai 3 weeks ago, whenever it was. The folks in the Arab world are producing electronic literature. That was what the point of this conference was about. And what they realized, and what we realized working together, was that they were doing the very thing that we did 22 years ago with terminology. They have like 6 or 7 different words for hypertext, and they can't settle. They haven't settled on one yet. And that doesn't seem like any big deal, except in 22 years ago, when we were doing this stuff, there was no search engine optimization. There was no keyword analysis. There was no Google, right? So you didn't search for things like this. Today, if you don't have the right terminology, you can't find it. So what they're having trouble with, because they haven't settled on a language system yet for this stuff, is findability. So we can't find their work. We can't find their animated text. We can't find their hypertext. They don't use a settled terminology for this stuff. So, yeah. Hi, Tom.
Hi. This is actually a question in some ways for John, but I think some people might have come to this either in this room or on the web as a way to experience what they might think of as a historical curiosity. This thing from 1996, it follows from the conversation you was having. But as a performer, is there something about what we might consider the comparatively crude presentation or affordances of this that actually, as you were performing, you felt worked particularly well as a live element of it? And we would look at that and just say, oh, well, this is what they could do with DOS or Visual Basic or whatever. But it's like saying we only had a certain set of paints, and so back then that's what it was, but the lack of a broad palette enables an artist to do certain things. So I'm curious, as a living document, is there something that this technological limitations actually helps or enhance what's going on in that poem in a way that to blow it out on on a 21st century level of digitization, sound, multimedia, would change the poem in ways that would be unhelpful? You sort of, is there something that is actually really, that works with 1990s and still makes something more significant than what we could do with it in the 21st century?
Well, that's a lot to respond to.
Sorry.
But thank you very much for presenting me with the opportunity. As I was listening to you phrase your question, the thought that came to my mind was mostly Balinese and Indonesian shadow puppet performances, where, and I don't mean at all to be dismissive of this, but utilizing very crude technology, essentially skin, hide, cutouts of characters known in the mythologies of these cultures that are operated with sticks to present movements of arms and legs, and a light behind these to cast a shadow on a piece of cloth. Amazing stories are told, stories that still have relevance, that still have meaning, that still have the ability to light up brains, imaginations, and carry culture and history and tradition forward from many decades before. And the way this works, I think, is through sound. The sound of the voice, the sound of the speaker, the sound of the storyteller's voice, the narrator behind screen or off stage, presenting these words in ways that will still resonate. The speaker's voice is in the text as it appears on the screen, and it carries through the fact that each of the words used in the display of this either internal or external dialogue are vessels capable of carrying meaning, but as vessels they are made up of all the meanings that they have ever carried before. So there's a richness, a texture, a complexity to the language. And so the language that's being used here in its textual format, carrying forward all the meanings associated with the original storyteller's voice, is very powerful. And yes, it might be portrayed in a current day, technologically inferior sort of context. The power of the storytelling, the power of the human emotion in that storytelling is still there. And I think if we were to look at that in the future, we would want to say, this is what we want to maintain. How are we going to maintain this power if we're going to put this poem, for example, into virtual reality, augmented reality, or participatory holographic worlds, whatever might be the future in regard to digital media, digital technology, and digital culture.
What's really frustrating is that when we make things, the first question out of someone's mouth when they're looking at it is, oh, what did you make this with? Is this Flash? Is this, is this HTML? We're like crows and shiny things. We love the shiny things, and what we're not really looking at first glance is what's being relayed, the information, the sentiments, the expression. And I think the argument I try to make to anyone that asks me about electronic literature and its importance is the fact that, as John says, it's a way to continue to convey the human condition. I think literature is so important. I think poetry is the most important of all literature, frankly, because it does capture the human condition in a way that so few things does. And if you can take that, we're losing people reading poetry today. We're losing people reading novels today. Unless you're assigned it, you're probably not picking up a novel and reading it. So, the goal of electronic literature organization, and a lot of us that are involved in it, is to keep literature alive, because it does parlay that experience so that we all realize we're not alone. We've all been in crappy relationships that we're too cowardly to get out of. We hope the other person walks out before we have to, and then claim responsibility. That is so normal. When you read something like Homer's Odyssey and you realize that Penelope and Odysseus are fighting, husband and wife arguing. This happens today, thousands of years later. you know, just being able to get that across so that we're not alone. We're not, this experience is the same, it's been going on forever, and we can learn something from it. That's at the heart of what we do. So when we teach VR, some of you are in the VR class, when we teach coding, whatever it is you're doing, it's that's the most important thing, and it drives the decisions you make on the tech you use. So it becomes like a really lovely dance, a tango between the word, the expression, and the tech, right? So it's not the tech first.
Yeah, I mean, I could see one of the answers is that format forces your attention on the core element of whatever a story is, that you can't use a visual as a crutch or anything else. And it seems like, to echo what you were saying, the answer is what you make that with, and the answer could be loss, memories, not Windows Basic or anything else like that, because that sounds like, John, what you were saying is that the core of this is a story. And if you don't have the story right, no matter if you have a set of Oculus glasses or not, it's going to be terrible.
I do think too there's like a nuance to the older technology that you do lose in newer technologies per se. It's like the same reason why the record player is still a thing that people buy and use, because there's a nuance to listening to a record that you don't get in the digital space. And so in the older technologies, I mean, the same thing with, like, if you watch a flash site, you know, you click through that, it's different than the way we do animation on the web today. It's way different. And there's a lot of flash sites I like a lot, you know, and I haven't seen it yet directly emulated to the nth degree in the newer technologies yet. So there's, you know, there is I do think there's a change that happens, and it takes time for this. And you know, you might lose things too, lose nuances. So I really like some of the nuances that you got with the reading of this piece.
Yeah, you read that beautifully. I think, you know, the all caps, you know, he uses the text to guide the reading so that you know when he's incredulous, he's saying something with you know, great passion, and there's times when he's thinking, the thoughts are just quietly in his mind, and he does that textually. And John, I think you picked that up well, you know, in reading that.
Thank you.
It's hard,
I was going to say, I mean, I think there are, when you talk about bright, shiny objects and how some of the, you know, how the readings or the use of some of the text technologies that were being developed in the 90s might allow us to do some different things. It is interesting that, I mean, there were things being developed that I think you could use to create stories in ways that now we can't. I'm thinking specifically about something like stretch text, which was a fantastic tool, and it just kind of got, you know, people were talking about it a little bit, and then it got over, you know, kind of got passed by. But we don't really have something now that you really, I mean, you can kind of create that with hypertext now, but you don't really have something that can do exactly.
Well, the loss of Flash is the same thing. I mean, Flash was another technology that was very, very useful. I mean, it could be everything from cinematic to interactive, and it had a lot of, but it was, at the heart of it was the cinema, right? The movement across the screen that you can't get with JavaScript. It's disjunctive. It's not the same experience. But, you know, Kate, when we were at the Arab ELIT conference, Kate House was the keynote speaker, and she was there during the conference asking questions as well. As one of the points she made, I thought was a really interesting was that we've been talking a lot about affordances and constraints. You know, what can the medium do? And what she was saying was we need to quit using that language. That really and truly, what we should be focusing on is a partnership with computers to think about, you know, what we can do rather than what we can't do. And so I thought that was, you know, a different way of thinking about how we produce.
Well, I think that that's a very good point, because it speaks to that no matter what software platform we might use, we're still just using it as a way of telling a story. And so there needs to be a story. There needs to be a story at the center of whatever feature or affordance of whatever platform we're trying to realize. If there isn't a story, if there isn't a compelling story, then what's the reason for anybody to spend any time with whatever we might present electronically? And I think just to repeat an earlier comment, changing list of names and combinations of terms that Kendall uses on the title page of the work to suggest ways of naming this endeavor. Not only is it typically academic and the proclivity to name something, categorize it, therefore we know what it is in relation to everything else, but I think it's also a very interesting way of promoting new ways of, or different ways of looking at something which is new at that time. And these terms haven't survived until present day, but they still resonate and still could be used to describe work that's being done.
I actually have something to say. Going back to the whole constraints and the how complicated it was to program things during that time period. People were always thinking, how can I make my story come across better? How can I use these elements? So you took a little bit more time, it seems like, to create these elements. Because nowadays it's like click, click, change colors, there, you're done. Back then you had to seriously sit and think, how can I get my point across?
Mm-hmm.
So Rob is online and Judy Malloy. So Judy Malloy wrote Uncle Roger and its name is Penelope. We'll be doing Its Name is Penelope next month. And then we end the series with Lust by Mary Kim Arnold. But I want to mention some of the things that Rob and Judy have said. So Rob says, I had to call it Hypertext because otherwise Eastgate wouldn't have published it. That's a really, thank you Rob for that, because that tells us a lot about the time period and the publisher, because if you might not know this, but there was only 2 publishers that I know of that were publishing a lot of hypertext work and early work. One was Eastgate Systems Inc., and then one came a little bit later, and that was Voyager. Voyager no longer exists, and we have a few of their works, published works here in the lab, but Eastgate's still working today. They're still alive. So, and then Robert says also they were a hypertext-only shop. Robert Coover wouldn't write about it in the New York Times if it wasn't hypertext. And for those of you who don't know this, Robert Coover in 1992 wrote The End of Books, which is a very famous editorial in the New York Book of Reviews, and put hypertext and electronic literature on the map. And that was 26 years ago. Robert Coover's still alive, and he's at Brown University. And we had a conference at Brown in 2010 and honored him at a dinner. So, and then Rob says also the only variety of ELIP that people took serious interest in during that time was hypertext. So those are 3 key points. So thank you, Rob, for adding that. And then Judy adds, when I first read this work, I considered it hypertext because to a certain extent the different mood changes put the reader on a different path, in different paths and interpretations. And that's a great point. So hypertext not in terms of functionality of technology, but of functionality of emotion, of human emotion. Robert Kendall also mentions that hypertext was a very open term back then. So some good points there. Any other questions? I'm looking here to see if I can get any more. Here we go. Yeah. There's no more online right now, but if you guys have any other questions, we still have a little bit of time. I want to encourage you, if you like this, I'm going to encourage you, I'll send you some URLs of Kendall's later works that are online, that are the Flash. You'll have to get Flash on your computer, but Faith being one of them. He's got several pieces, and you can see that this experiment of changing text, he evolves into really interesting ways with Flash. So if you're a Flash freak like I am, it becomes really interesting. In Faith, one particular section, he mentions the term off your rocker, and the text literally rocks. So stuff like that, some really interesting use of movement in the space. John, you want to say anything else? In concluding remarks?
Concluding remarks. Well, it was a great pleasure. A wonderful opportunity to revisit a pioneering work of electronic literature. Great to be able to share it with everyone that's here in person and everyone that's online. Thank you, everyone, and go forward and be creative and productive. Save the world.
Just to remind everybody, in a month I'll be putting out, well, a couple of weeks I'll be putting out the notice for next month's, which is, its name is Penelope by Judy Malloy. Came out in 1992, and earlier than this one by 4 years. And it is a work of hypertext, a beautiful piece. And then following that is Mary Kim Arnold's Lust, published in 1994. So these are all early works. And if you want to see some of these on your own, we're always welcome. You're always welcome to come in. There's someone generally in here. If not, we can find someone to be in here. And we've got a lot of work in this cabinet that's just incredible to look at. Things that I even have early missed, and things like that. Yeah. And it plays really beautifully on that little Bonnie Blue computer over there. So we encourage you to look at the work on the original computer so that you can get a sense of how the work functioned at the time of its production and dissemination. So we can retain the cultural experience. Thank you.